This week on The Dead Life, I have a special guest who's the son of one of the first famous mediums to grace television, Richard Ireland. His son, Mark Ireland, has written a book about mediums, spirit visitations, and afterlife communication titled The Persistence of the Soul. I've known Mark for many years, and I know my Dead Life listeners will be fascinated by his journey. If you want to leave me a message that might be shared on a future episode of The Dead Life, leave it at 802-DEAD-811. That's 802-332-3811. You can follow me on Instagram at Medium Allison, on my Facebook fan page, and you can binge on my YouTube videos to watch readings, including episodes of The Dead Life. If you have abilities of your own and are looking to expand them and connect with other gifted people, go to deaduniversity.com. Well, Mark, welcome to The Dead Life.
Thanks, Allison. It's great to be here. I was just mentioning to you, we've known each other now for 19 years, which is hard to believe.
I know. The kids were just tiny then. I remember you coming over to the house for a reading.
Yeah. And the backstory there is pretty interesting because even though my dad was a pretty well-known psychic and medium he was kind of a pioneer in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up with that. I didn't really, I guess, strive to be like my dad. I mean, how many of us want to be our parent after all,
Right.
right?
So true.
So I took a more conventional path and went to the university, ASU, by the way, where you went. And
The Devils.
yeah, got
Mm-hmm.
a degree, went into the business world, got married at a young age, and had a couple of boys. And it was when my youngest son, Brandon, unexpectedly passed that we connected.
Right.
And it was kind of a synchronistic thing, too, because the way I found out about you was about 3 weeks after Brandon passed. I was watching the news, Channel 12 in Phoenix, the NBC
Mm-hmm.
affiliate,
Mm-hmm.
and they were showing a clip on a research study being done. And you were the featured medium in the study at the time. And I was really impressed. And then they debriefed with the sitters afterwards. And I thought, wow, I would love to have a reading from her. And the very next day, an old friend of my father's from Dallas, Texas, Jerry Concert, calls me and he says, "Hey, Mark, I know what you've been through, and I know someone who might be able to help you. Her name's Allison Dubois, and here's how you can contact her." And even then, before the show Medium came out, you
Yeah.
still had a pretty long wait list. So I think it was August before we got together. And I've got a interesting story correlated to that too, but I don't want to just run on here. I'll see if there's anything else you want to touch on first.
Well, Jerry was my cousin by marriage, and then they got divorced, and I kept him anyways. So
He's a keeper.
he's so much fun. So how did your father influence your study of the afterlife? Was it your father or was it your son's passing that sent you down that path?
Well, having grown up with a dad like that, I always knew there was more than just physical existence, and I knew that we were a soul in a
Yeah.
body for a while. So, and having seen him, I mean, he did a lot of psychic work in the secular world, in addition
Right.
to having his own kind of progressive church back in the day. It was more in the church you'd see the mediumship. But also even in secular venues, he would be doing a psychic demonstration, and periodically spirit would pop in with detailed information like an uncle and the name, sometimes the first and last name, and
Yeah.
details about them. So it really was touching to me as a young person growing up, just having that confidence, not just blind faith, but knowledge.
Right.
So, but then when your own kid passes, that's something no one's prepared for, no matter what you know or believe or anything, because you're still going to go through the shock of that physical disconnection.
Right.
Someone you've had in your life for 18 years in the case of Brandon. So I would say it was a catalyst for bringing me back into my dad's field, which I had not ignored completely, but I wasn't really focused on my spiritual life as much during that period of time. I was more into my career and advancement and all those kind of worldly accolades, and then
Sure.
I was jolted back into what's really more important, and that's how I ended up back into that, and then kind of went on my own personal journey
Yeah.
that was very fulfilling, and I've learned a lot. And even my dad used to say, "You're very psychic," and I'll be like, "Well, I can't do what you do, so I must not be psychic." But later had some pretty profound experiences of my own, so I know it's there in a latent way
Yeah.
and can be tapped into, now and then, whether spontaneously or if there's a need.
So your dad, he was on Was he on Merv Griffin? He ran the television circuit before most mediums ever were born. So
Yes.
he was pretty famous and very accurate.
Yeah, he was. There's a clip of him on the Steve Allen show that I think is really the best representation of
Steve
what he
Allen.
did.
Right.
And that, if people visit my website, which I imagine you have linked here, there's a link to that on my website. It
Right.
says "See Richard Ireland in Action" or something like that.
Yeah.
But
He needs
he
a
was on Merv Griffin too.
Oh, he
You
was?
were right about yeah. So you
Okay.
must have picked up on that as
I
well. But Steve Allen's the one I have a copy of. That's really the best video that I have of him.
Ironically, I ended up knowing Merv Griffin's granddaughter later, Farrah Griffin. And
Oh,
so that was just kind of interesting. And when I met her, I did think of you and your dad because all I could think was, I think his dad was on that show back then. So,
people will often say, "Oh, your dad was on Johnny Carson." I'm like, "No, that was Steve
uh,
Allen. He was supposed to be on Johnny Carson, but he was concerned that Carson would try and make a mockery of things, with
Carson
the
kind of did
turban and
that.
yeah,
Carmack and all of
yeah.
that. Yeah, I don't blame your dad. I remember when I met you and I read you and I came out and Joe was like, "Well, how was it?" And I said, "He kind of has your energy, Joe. Like he's science minded but open." It was a nice combination, but it was just interesting because I didn't get a lot of you were looking at it from a spiritual perspective, but you also didn't want to get conned, so you were paying attention to what was being said.
Well, I didn't distrust you. I wanted not to provide feedback so that it was a pure reading. You know what I'm saying? Not
Yeah.
to regurgitate everything. Like you don't want sitters really telling you a lot. So I was just being guarded, and it was probably too much that way. But I remember in your book, "We Are Their Heaven," there's
Mhm.
the one piece that I contributed, and I remember the description of me, and it included something about salt and pepper hair. Well, that's pretty much salt now.
That's all
but
right.
but you said that I reminded you of Joe or one of
Yeah.
his brothers or something like that. That they're more engineering minded. And I have an analytical side for sure, but I'd say I'm more in the middle and probably more right brain today than left brain. It's just that I was trying to be guarded, to wanted to have kind of a pure experience, but
I
it was
get
still
it.
great.
Fortunately, I was trained in a laboratory, so I was comfortable not getting any of the feedback in the reading and just continuing with my information. And I think back then I would write a page of information before you ever got there to the
Yes, yes.
reading. And I would go through the information that I got prior to you showing up.
Yeah,
So,
I think you gave me 3 or 4 or 5 pages,
yeah.
which I'm so frustrated that I lost them, but
No.
I did I have an audio recording of it still after all these years, so I've still got everything there. And I'll share a little story from that reading that was pretty cool. So, 2 weeks before we had the reading, I ran into someone that my dad knew,
Mhm.
and he handed me a box, and inside the box were all these 8.5 by 11 type pages. And I look at it, it looked like to be a manuscript. And it was called "Your Psychic Potential: A Guide to Psychic Development" by Richard Ireland, dated 1973.
Mhm.
I said, "Where'd you get this?" And he said, "Well, your dad gave it to me for safekeeping before he passed because you were out of state at the time." I'm like, "Well, why? It's been 12 years. Why are you giving this to me now?" And he says, "I don't know. I just feel like I'm supposed to." 2 weeks later, I meet you. One of the very first things you said to me was, "I have your father here, and he's showing me a book, but I believe it's his book, but he's handing it to you to take forward. Does that make sense?" I'm
Right.
like, "Yeah, I think I get it." And today I've actually had that book published. It's been out for over a decade now. So
Is that
I was
the persistence of the soul or is that a different book?
that's a different book. The Persistence of the Soul is my own book, that just came out. Thank you. Uh, but and people will they'll find unique about that book's a combination of right brain and left brain. So it's a lot of personal experiences
Yeah.
and stories, but it's also backed by more evidence, science, and then I also delve into the debunker type skeptics and kind of show their ploys and things like that, so people won't be too swayed by them, hopefully, and understand their tactics.
Yeah.
And then I have a chapter on religion and history of these phenomena, because that's another touchy area for people that are more of a
Yes.
traditional or fundamentalist background to understand. Hey, if you've been taught by your pastor or peers at your church that there's something wrong with this, you don't know your scripture well enough,
Right.
because it's packed with these kinds of things. I mean, those are the gifts of the Spirit. And I remember when I first came up with my first book, I shared that with you. I said, you said you liked it and you wrote an endorsement. I said, what was your favorite part? And you actually liked the fact that I included the scripture to kind of validate that. Not that I'm any super religious type person, but
Sure.
I feel like if you're going to deal with people, you have to understand where they're coming from and understand that. So it's a combination of, my personal stories, some of which are pretty crazy and phenomenal and affirming, and also that other evidence to support it.
I think that's an important book to have written and for people to read. So I do hope they get The Persistence of the Soul, because I find that it's very normal, first of all, for people to want some of the analytics along with the soulful aspect to mediumship and the afterlife. So this is a book that I think will resonate with more people. And touching on religion is important because a lot of people haven't gotten the memo that you don't go to hell if you commit suicide. Yeah. And I've brought a lot of suicides through. And I interviewed that Catholic priest, Father Nathan Castle. I believe he was in We Are Their Heaven in the back of the book towards the end. And it was just really nice and refreshing to meet a man of the cloth who is a practicing medium as well. So I'd like to hear a little bit about the journey that you went on making this book. But I was very interested when I saw your chapter titled The Skeptical Neuroses. So,
Well,
can you tell
that's
me
the
about
one.
that?
That's the chapter I was just touching on lightly. Basically, I think skepticism is a good characteristic for anyone to have, just to
Mhm.
question things. But it means
A healthy
an
measure of
yeah,
skepticism. Yeah.
open-minded inquiry,
Mhm.
as opposed to, well, he's deceased now, but James Randi, his approach, or people like that who
Oh,
are just I know it's frustrating.
I dealt with Randy and all of his disciples when Medium was out.
Yeah. Well, it, it's there's still some of them out there. I don't want to even name them. I don't want to give them that
Sure. I
that
think
promo.
I think people stopped listening to them a long time ago because their arguments never changed and their arguments had been debunked by us. The
Right.
irony of that, right? So, and then if you look into the past of some of these people, they're sort of disturbed individuals. And I know with James Randi, he definitely had some courtroom drama, we'll just say, and issues with, how do I put this delicately, being inappropriate with underage people. So I found that most of the people that are into being a professional skeptic are the most wounded people I've ever met in my life. And one of those people, and I think you probably would know this, was Penn Jillette
Oh, yeah.
and the magician. And I used to joke, I'm like, did he marry his manager? Because I don't know how he's still on TV for anything. but, and I think he did actually. But he's got so much hatred in his heart when it comes to psychics mediums. I've talked to people who have walked out of his magic show because he starts berating the people who do believe in psychics and life after death, even though he tries to demonstrate cold readings and fails miserably himself,
Yep.
proving his own theory. So, yes, we deal.
Well, there's an example in that chapter where I talked about Montague Keene, who you probably remember that name from the years ago, who was involved in a test. It was like a TV documentary thing, but it was heavily slanted for them on the skeptics or debunkers side. I won't even give them
Right,
the privilege of calling them skeptics.
right.
But he noted that,
Cynics. They're
yeah,
cynics. Mm,
cynics, exactly.
yes.
but they were editing out the positive things that had actually happened. The audience
Right.
saw it, it was just like, this is BS.
Yeah.
So that's what I was trying to get at there, I think, just to give a more balanced view. And the other thing I was going to comment, in addition to being wounded, I think a lot of them actually were raised in fundamentalist religious families or had preacher parents who were beating them over the head with the hellfire brimstone message. And so this was their rebellious reaction to overreaction, because what they've done really is, as I put it, throw the spiritual bathwater out with the baby, or the baby out with the bathwater.
Right. And
Religion and spirituality aren't the
you have
same
you have
thing.
to really ask where their hatred and the anger comes from. And Penn Jillette, I had crossed paths with filming a pilot years ago, and he felt like he had abandonment issues. That's the energy he was carrying. And it's almost a sense of the afterlife can't exist where loved ones come through for the living because nobody wants to talk to me. Like nobody came for him. It's like, well, maybe they did, and you're not hearing them because you're so caught in your head and focused on the argument and the hatred. They can't get through to you. And after a while, they're going to pull their energy back. So he would even be able to get himself to a place of communication. But when you don't believe it's possible, you're never going to get there.
Yeah, because the best readings are really going to happen between two people that loved each other on the other side of the veil, and a good medium in between.
Yeah.
If you don't have that, or you're even as closed off as I was, that love was still there.
Yes.
I was just trying to be protective. But if I came in thinking this is
Oh no,
impossible,
you were fine. It wasn't bad
yeah,
in any way with
yeah.
you. It
But
just
if somebody
go ahead.
somebody comes in thinking it's impossible, that's a whole nother thing,
And
or they're negative toward it.
those are cynics, because skeptics, healthy skepticism, I'm totally fine with. Obviously, I am. I dealt with scientists and, dedicated my time in the laboratory for 4 years. So obviously, I could deal with science-minded people. It's the ones who think they have all the answers, which I find is incredibly arrogant to take that stance. So yes, anytime a psychic or medium gets famous, they've got their little lynch mob that gets sort of deployed online and comes for you. But I find that the pendulum's really swung, and especially with Gen Z and the millennials, they're very open. And it's so refreshing. And my friend Tom McMullen, who's an astrologer, our astrologer on The Dead Life, and my professor of astrology for Dead University, he's just so interesting when it comes to dealing with the, myriad of energy that comes through and being able to know somebody's chart and know how to approach them. And I think I've picked up some of that with him. So it helps me to adjust. But I have found that women will tend to be more open to being read because they're more emotionally based beings. That's why you see more female mediums as well.
Yeah.
But for the men that can really open themselves up, they'll have a great reading. So
Yeah.
it's just a matter of being open to the process.
Yeah, I agree. And touching on that, I co-founded an organization for bereaved parents now that's just ballooned to where we have 26,000 members worldwide.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you. We have 175 affiliate chapters. We have a conference every other year. The last one we had in August last year, we drew 900 people, and we'll have another one in 24. But it's 90% women.
Right.
However, at the conference, a lot of the women bring their husbands. So that was a phenomenal thing to have happen, because it was very healing. And
Yeah.
a lot of these guys got dragged to it, and then it
Yeah.
opened their minds up, and they really were exposed to
They
things they
needed
hadn't
it.
really considered. Yeah, they needed it. So
Mhm.
it's interesting you were talking about the debunker thing. I just wanted to touch on one more thing. And I bring this into that chapter too, or at least one of the chapters. There's a scientist in England named Rupert Sheldrake. He's a really good guy, but he's on the other side, on our side, I guess I would say,
Yeah.
of this. And he did this study called when dogs who know when their owners are coming home. And so he did an experiment, because these people would report, hey, my dog always knows when I'm coming home, even when there's no auditory cues or anything like that. So he set up a camera and a clock and all this stuff. And sure enough, this one test dog had that, it was there at the door waiting for the owner before the owner got close, and the owner came at various times.
Hmm.
So then there was a man named Richard Wiseman, who's one of these debunker type scientists, and he says, well, I'd like to replicate your experiment. So Sheldrake gave him all the criteria, and then later Wiseman did it, but with I think Sheldrake had like 100 episodes or 100 trials of this, and Wiseman had maybe 5 or 6.
Right.
And then Wiseman went to some skeptic conference and declared it a failure. But then Sheldrake looked at the results and he goes, wait a minute, the results are identical to mine. But what he had done is shifted the requirements in his experiment after the fact, which is totally non-scientific.
He changed the controls.
Yep. So enough about those folks.
That's what they do because they'll never win the argument. I remember saying to Penn Jillette, well, if you ever want to learn about life after death, I'm open to that kind of discussion. But otherwise, and this is for all the professional cynics out there, I could kill you, and if I can't bring you through, then I guess you were right. They just shut up because they didn't know what to say. But it's ridiculous. It's like you have this short life to live. Why put so much energy into going after something that they don't even understand? And that's the frustrating part when it comes to dealing with cynics, which is something that I teach my mediumship students, of who you don't deal with because it's a waste of time and energy. So yes, I hadn't thought of that until I was looking at the outline of your book, and because I haven't had to deal with them for a long time. I'm so thick-skinned now because I've been doing this for over 20 years. So people just ricochet right off of me. I'm like, whatever, because I don't really care if they believe in life after death. If people want to seek the knowledge, it's there for them. But if somebody's just going to take it to their grave, not believing, that's their life. I don't have a problem with that. I'm not going to tell them how to live. I'm here for the people who do believe or are at least open to being proven true in the communication department of talking to to the dead after they die and maintaining that connection. So that's what mediums are here for. I like to say, I'm a secretary. I'm a secretary to the dead. And this is particularly helpful. And this is for anybody trying to learn out there about mediumship. If you're ever reading somebody and you're bringing a man through, especially men of older generations, if I explain that I'm a secretary, they seem comfortable with that dynamic, that they have to give me the information and I pass it on to the person they love. And it's made it easier for me to communicate with the men on the other side of certain generations in saying that, rather than saying, I'm a psychic, I'm a medium, just talk to me, I'll tell them. I'm a secretary. Give me your information, I'll pass it along. And they do and then they get comfortable with it and they don't care. But it's just that initial meeting and sort of finding a balance between our two worlds and what I'm doing for them that they don't always understand.
Yeah, and you even used an old school term there in secretary rather than, what was it, assistant or something like that today. So
I'm okay with that. I'll be a secretary. I used to tell people on flights I was a secretary. They're like, what do you do? I don't want to tell them what I do. They'll never shut up. So I'm like, well, I'm a secretary. They're immediately silent and they turn their back to me. I'm like, this is excellent. So it worked for me.
To cap off the skeptic debunker thing, though, I think first off, for most of them, it's a worldview. So you're trying to shift somebody's worldview, and that's very difficult to do.
Yes.
They would have to shift it themselves based on experience.
And it's built on pain usually.
Yeah.
And you can't get into their childhood pain when they're just guarded and they're not going to let you get there. It's a big process. I hear you.
And some of them, like a Michael Shermer, I think they feel like they want to feel intellectually superior. So they would look down on us as like, you guys are stupid or something like that. When I'm sorry, they're the ones that are actually stupid because they're closed off.
Well, and nobody will want to hear from them when they die. Like nobody.
Well, then it's not going to make their life any easier as people pass away in their own life and when they're facing their own mortality either.
I think it makes them be able to face their mortality because they're afraid. They fear dying so deeply, to know that everybody's just going to go and there's nothing you can do about it, rather than to believe that we live soulfully and stay connected with our loved ones and have that relationship that maybe never existed for them in the physical world to begin with. They may have never had a relationship that was that loving or strong. It was all academically based or nothing that they ever let get to the center of their self. And so I think it makes them happy to just think everybody goes to the same place and that's nothingness and darkness. They're just very deeply negative people that don't have any light in their life. And I feel badly for them. But I'll tell you this, people who believe in the other side live life much happier and much better. And they take risks and believe in themselves. It's just a healthier way to live.
Well, the same thing applies to people who have had near-death experiences.
Hmm.
When you look at that research and the numbers,
Yeah,
the vast majority come back. They change their life focus to what's more important: service, taking care of other people. They value their life. They don't fear death anymore. So
right.
yeah, it's
No,
just another avenue.
I hear you. So, can you tell me what did you learn from the mediums in your search for answers as you were read person by person? What was resonating with you? Was there a lot of repetition in the information they were giving you?
Well, in the first book, Soul Shift, and you were one of the four readings in that book, yes, there was a lot of overlap. So that was really cool to see, the congruence of information. But each person had a little tidbit here or there that was like an add on that maybe the other didn't have, which
A
was
little
cool.
bonus, yeah.
Yeah. And then, the second book is not as much chronicling medium readings, but I pop in a lot of them. Um, and I would say some of those, the variation there wasn't so much in the second book. A lot of it was for me, but it was just things I observed that pertain to other people where I saw, what a drop in is, right? So I saw a case where, well, a drop in would be like if you got a message for someone who's not your sitter, but someone they know.
Oh,
And then,
yes,
and
I've gotten those. I've never
yeah,
heard
so
that term though.
yeah, drop in.
A
But
drop in.
so I've got some examples of those. I think those could be very compelling too, because one argument people who even believe in psychic phenomena could make is, oh, you're using
Telepathic,
telepathy with a
right.
sitter. But
Right.
in a case like that, you couldn't necessarily, where maybe the person might recognize a few things you say. There's a lot more information you share that they can't identify till they go talk to the other person. And so
That
I have, and
that was actually one of the things when I was in the laboratory that we were able to eliminate that argument of telepathy because what the deceased was telling us had to be validated by a third party because our sitter didn't know the answer to what the dead was telling us. That's interaction between us and the dead, and it's information that the living didn't have. The other theory was the super psi theory that there's a pocket of energy out in the universe and we're just communicating with this almost like impression running on a loop and it's just a pocket of energy. It's like, no, they're interactive. And the theory of super psi isn't interactive. Souls are interactive. So we were able to eliminate all theories and came back to the obvious that there's life after death.
survival.
I know. I was pretty proud of those 4 years. I did learn a lot. Um, is your spiritual journey something that your wife shares with you?
Totally. Now, she was raised in a more conventional religious upbringing as a Lutheran, but
Mhm.
very open-minded. I She actually, on our second date, way before we ever got married, I was 19 years old. I wasn't a good planner, and I came a little late. So
What
I'm like, hey,
19-year-old is? That's okay.
yeah. So I'm like, do you want to go see my dad tonight? He's a psychic. And she's like, oh, that sounds interesting. Let's go do that. So I take her there. We get there late, and this, but some people don't.
I love this
Do
story.
he'd
Please.
do blindfold billets. So he'd take these. He had 10 strips of Johnson medical white tape, which is opaque and very sticky. That would go over his eyes. 3 black blindfolds that were completely opaque, and then more tape down here so people couldn't allege he was looking out. It was
Right.
ridiculous. He didn't
Right.
need all that, but by the time we got there, he was already answering questions. And I said, hey, Susie, why don't you write a question? And she goes, well, what do I write? I said, anything, maybe something about the future or whatever. So she wrote, will my mother ever get married? And her mom had been divorced from her dad for years. She was dating a man for an extended period of time, but she'd been pretty non-committal. So that's Susie's question. She sends it up. My dad's already halfway through. He doesn't know we're there. I didn't tell him it was coming. So the message goes up, and a little bit, he grabs her paper and says, Susie Sap Soup Soup. And she says, it's Susie Sipe. And he says, well, I think you've asked me a question about your mother and if she'll ever be getting married. Well, I don't know about your mother, my dear, but you have made your choice of men, and he's with you tonight. And
Oh,
then I spoke up and I said, Dad, this is Mark. Susie's my date. And he says,
ah,
oh my gosh, I just married off my own son.
ah. You've met his daughter-in-law, his future daughter-in-law. I think that's amazing. Your
It was
dad
pretty
sounds
cool.
incredible. I'm sorry that I only met him in spirit, but I was very honored to have brought him through in your reading. But he just sounds incredible. And for each generation, one of us comes along and tries to break that glass ceiling, and then there's another ceiling, and then another person's got to come along, and it's a process. But your dad was one of the originals, one of the OGs that came in and used a bigger medium than him, television, to touch people and to change minds or open minds, if you will. So that's a very important position he played in life.
And I think, his knowing how to bring through people when he was on this side probably makes him better on that side.
It
So I
does.
remember when
Yeah.
you were reading, you were saying he feels like he's actually here, physically here,
Yes.
just how strong his energy was. But back in his day, he had to present it as more entertainment, especially in secular venues. It was just wouldn't have been digested if he's like, "Hey, I have Uncle Joe here," and he
Right.
says, this or that. It had to be more entertainment, and then that was enough to like crack someone's mind open, just enough that they would start thinking about it. Like, well, how
Mhm.
did that happen? Or maybe there's more than meets the eye here.
And then later we got to go in all in, and I was commenting on the Natalie Holloway case and Elizabeth Smart, and I took more of a crime angle to it when I came through. And I'm waiting to see who the younger person is, because I know there's a young medium out there, but I don't think he's good enough. I'm waiting
Uh,
for somebody absolutely gigantic in abilities to come along and really take a crack at that ceiling. So I'm sure it'll happen. Do you ever go to Lilydale? Did your dad ever take you there?
no, but there was a camp similar called Camp Chesterfield, Indiana, that
Oh,
I was there
cool.
as a kid.
Yeah.
Um, so I
So
remember that.
they
But
had a camp for kids with parents and families with abilities.
exactly. Although when I went there, I was only 10 years old, so I don't remember a lot of the
That's
details.
cool. I love
Yeah, but they had all kind of different things going on all the time, and different people with different sorts of abilities. And then if you wanted a reading, you could set it up, and you'd have your choice of different people and things like that.
That's very cool. I love that.
Yeah.
I got to work with children in Lilydale in the
Oh,
schoolhouse there, and I broke them up into groups. And it's so interesting to work with them, because you'll always see that one that stands out, that one that's better than all the rest. Now, you'll see abilities in a lot of the other kids. I saw their abilities, but there's always one that just shines. It's amazing. I loved working with them, though. And my daughters got to help at that event, which was very cool. So I was just curious. I asked out of curiosity. So, what's next for you? Where can people find your book, or you, if they want to learn more information about you and your dad?
well, since the book just came out, I'm kind of binging on doing podcasts and radio interviews and all kinds of stuff. I was even on Coast to Coast AM, which is a big deal for me. And I'll probably be on there again after the first of the year. So, but my website has everything. It's markirelandauthor.com. Mark with a K, Ireland like the country, author, markirelandauthor.com. And not only are the books there, the links to them on the 11 different Amazon sites in different countries, Barnes and
And
Noble,
we'll
all
we'll have
those.
a link as well on my
Cool.
website.
And then
Absolutely.
on my site, there's a link to the Helping Parents Heal website for bereaved parents who are looking for support.
Very
There's a
important.
link to my dad's videos on that site that you can see those, the Steve Allen and some of the others. There's also a link to a certified medium site. So this is something I do. It's not like I'm a scientist or anything, but there were a lot of folks after my books came out that wanted a reference for a medium, and in all price ranges and all
Right.
wait times, because like when I first met you, I knew maybe half a dozen mediums, and you guys had long, long wait lists. So I wanted to give other people resources, and I figured there's got to be some undiscovered talent out there. So uh, these folks go through 5 blinded readings and provide statistically significant results. So I have
That's
some resources
amazing.
for people that need them. You
So
know,
can mediums that want to be part of that come to your website and
yep,
be tested by you? I see.
totally.
I think you're the perfect balance because I worked with the hardcore scientists in the laboratory, and they'd write their books, but a little lacking in the emotion. And you have a lot of your heart in the books that you write and your mind. You're also multi generational in the field of psychic mediumship. And I think, this is your son dying became the catalyst for your purpose and why you're here. And on behalf of all the parents that you help, thank you. And the people that you steer towards reliable mediums out there, because I don't have time to test mediums all the time. I've got my own classroom. I'm already doing that. And then I've got the podcast and readings, and life's busy. Not that you're not, but mine's particularly challenging. And I used to put up Lori Campbell, and I'd have some that I'd put up that were tried and true. But nowadays, it's hard to keep up after 20 years, with
Yeah.
who's in it and now who's going to take a year off and who's going to come back. And I just started saying word of mouth, go by word of mouth, because if you have friends that have been to somebody legitimate, that's a good direction. Or with tarot and psychics, I sent them to Margaret Jameson, who's my professor of earth magic at Dead University. But we might look at some of your resources and check that out too, and put it on ours. And a link to your parents group should also be added as a link on my resources on my website. So I'll talk to Joe about that, because
Okay.
the parents that are in pain and healing, I feel like that's a great big part of my purpose of being here. It's the parents. And I remember when I'd tour and I'd be at an event, and I was in Australia at this one in particular, but I would always close with raise your hand if you have a loss of child, because I wanted to make sure I got to the most traumatic readings. And a woman raised her hand, and Joe went to her, and she said, well, it's actually a dog. It's not exactly my child, but it feels like a child. If you could have seen my face, Mark, I'm sure you can imagine. And I looked at her and I said, I'm not bringing your dog through. I'm bringing someone's child through. So I'm going to invite you to have a seat and enjoy the rest of the show. And I went on to a parent, and I read a couple parents before I tied it up. And that one was pissed. But borders and boundaries, people, and it really is the parents that are shattered, and they have to put themselves back together in a new way. And I'm sure you've seen this, and you've been this, where you look at them and they're barely breathing. They're such shallow breaths. They're barely part of the human existence anymore. Like they died with their child, and they look like they're white knuckling it through life, and you could just feel the pain permeating off of them. And I just want to help to relieve some of that so that they can move forward. I find one of the things that does help is, and I had somebody say this a long time ago that I brought through, it was somebody's child. And he said, ask my mom if she loved me enough to die for me. Will she love me enough to live for me? And I had repeated that to her. And I said, I know this is the harder ask, but it's what he's asking of you. And she slowly came back to life. So it's interesting, the stories that we are privy to. And when you live for them, you get more communication from them. There are more signs. They live vicariously through you. If your son always wanted to go surfing in Hawaii, you can take that trip for him, prop up a picture of him, do that. He can experience it through you. So much like when women are pregnant with children, or dads are loving their children before they're born, we act as surrogates for them in the afterlife, and still give them those living opportunities. especially with the food. They love the food.
Yeah, I think this world's a little different than that side.
Yeah,
It's
definitely.
more challenging,
I'm
but
gonna
it
have
also,
to I'm gonna have you back though, because there's so much to unpack with you, and I just feel like we need to have this conversation again and go through your book some more. So maybe if you
great.
want to come back in a couple of weeks, we'll do it again if you don't mind.
No, I'd love to. That'd be great, and the timing's perfect too. So thank you for the opportunity.
Oh my gosh. Oh, stop anytime. I've known you forever. You were at my first book signing party.
That's
Remember?
right.
Did I
That
not
was at the
serve?
Ritz
I served
at the Ritz
delicious hors
Carlton.
d'oeuvres. Yes, the Ritz-Carlton in Phoenix. I handpicked all those hors d'oeuvres, and I came back after signing books, and everything was gone. I was like, "That's all about the food." But that was an amazing party, and you were there, and I'll never forget that. So thank you for supporting me too before I was somebody. I
Yeah, well, you
appreciate
were
you.
already somebody. You just weren't known.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. So it's been a real pleasure. You're going to have to come back soon. And thank you to Mark Ireland for expanding our minds. And thank you to my listeners. Tune in next Tuesday for a fresh episode of The Dead Life. I'm Allison Dubois. This is The Dead Life. And to all of my believers out there, don't stop believing.